The last thing Ethan Dalton wanted to do on a crisp October Saturday evening was sit across from a stranger in an overpriced restaurant, pretending to be interested in small talk. But his mother had been relentless, her gentle insistence wearing him down over months of well-meaning pressure, and he found himself adjusting his tie in the mirror of his car before walking into Giovanni's with resignation settling in his chest. At 32, Ethan had built an empire in commercial real estate development, turning a modest inheritance into a portfolio worth over $300 million. His days started at 5 in the morning and often ended past midnight, filled with acquisition meetings, construction site inspections, and negotiations that would make lesser men crumble. Romance had never factored into the equation. Women came and went, mostly attracted to his bank account or the sharp cut of his suits, and he had learned to keep his distance. Cold, his employees called him behind his back. Efficient, he preferred to think. His mother, Margaret, saw it differently. She saw loneliness in the space between his achievements, and she had orchestrated this blind date with the daughter of her book club friend. Ethan had agreed only to stop her worried phone calls, planning to endure one tedious evening and then return to his regularly scheduled life. The hostess led him to a table by the window where a woman already sat, her back to him. Dark auburn hair fell in soft waves past her shoulders, and she wore a simple cream-colored sweater that looked nothing like the designer labels he was used to seeing on dates. As he approached, she turned, and Ethan felt something unexpected catch in his throat. She had the kind of face that belonged in a Renaissance painting with high cheekbones, a delicate nose, and eyes the color of warm honey. But what struck him most was the nervousness radiating from her, the way her hands fidgeted with the cloth napkin in her lap, the slight tremor in her smile as she recognized him from the description his mother must have provided. "Clara Holmes?" he asked, extending his hand. "Yes." "You must be Ethan." Her voice was soft, almost musical, and when she shook his hand, her grip was surprisingly firm despite her obvious anxiety. He sat down, studying her as she quickly looked away, focusing on the menu with an intensity that suggested she was using it as a shield. Most women he met made immediate eye contact, leaning forward with practiced interest. Clara seemed like she wanted to disappear into her chair. "I have to be honest," Ethan said, deciding directness was the best approach. "My mother essentially blackmailed me into this. I hope you are not offended." Clara looked up, surprise flickering across her features before a genuine smile broke through. "Mine too. Well, not blackmail exactly, but she has been relentless. Apparently being 28 and single is a tragedy of epic proportions in her mind." The honesty disarmed him. Ethan found himself relaxing slightly, ordering wine when the waiter appeared, watching as Clara requested water instead. She noticed his glance and offered a small, self-conscious laugh. "I do not drink much. It makes me even more awkward than I already am, if you can believe that is possible." "You seem fine to me," Ethan said, and meant it. Throughout dinner, Clara spoke about her work as a librarian at the city's main branch, and Ethan discovered she ran literacy programs for underprivileged children and elderly immigrants learning English. Her face lit up when she described a 70-year-old woman from Vietnam who had just read her first English novel, or the 10-year-old boy who had been struggling until they found the right book to spark his interest. She listened with genuine attention when he talked about his latest project, a mixed-use development that would revitalize a struggling neighborhood, asking thoughtful questions about community impact rather than profit margins. Hours passed without Ethan checking his phone once, a miracle considering he usually reviewed emails between courses. Clara made him laugh with stories about eccentric library patrons, including an elderly man who insisted on reading every book in alphabetical order by author, and was currently making his way through the Ceticus. She blushed when Ethan caught her staring at him, but there was something refreshing about her transparency, the way she could not hide what she was feeling when the check came. Clara reached for her purse, but Ethan waved her off. She did not argue, just thanked him quietly, and they walked out into the cool evening air together. "I should probably call a car," Clara said, pulling out her phone. "Let me drive you home," Ethan offered before he could think better of it. "It is late." She hesitated, clearly weighing propriety against practicality before nodding. His car, a sleek black Mercedes, felt too ostentatious suddenly as he opened the passenger door for her. Clara slid in without comment, giving him an address in a modest neighborhood across town. They drove in comfortable silence for a while before Clara spoke. "This was not as terrible as I expected." "High praise," Ethan said dryly, and she laughed. "I mean it. I have not enjoyed an evening this much in a long time. You are not what I expected either." "What did you expect?" "Someone more pretentious, I suppose. My mom said you were very successful, and usually that means someone who talks about themselves the entire time, but you actually listened when I rambled about books and literacy rates." "You were not rambling. I found it interesting." He paused, making a decision that felt simultaneously reckless and inevitable. "Would you want to do this again, without the pressure of our mothers orchestrating it?" Clara turned to look at him, surprise evident in her expression. "Really, really? Then yes, I would like that very much." He got her number before she disappeared into a small apartment building, and Ethan drove home feeling oddly energized despite the late hour. For the first time in years, he found himself thinking about someone other than work as he fell asleep. Their second date happened 3 days later at a small coffee shop Clara suggested. Nothing like the upscale venues Ethan usually frequented. She was waiting outside when he arrived, wearing jeans and a soft blue sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her look younger. They talked for 3 hours over coffee that cost less than $5, and Ethan realized he could not remember the last time he had felt this engaged with another person. Clara was different from anyone he had ever dated. She had no interest in his money, actually seemed uncomfortable when he mentioned the scope of his business. She worked at the library because she loved books and believed in their power to change lives, not because she was building toward something more lucrative. Her apartment, which he saw briefly when he picked her up for their third date, was tiny but filled with overflowing bookshelves and plants. Cozy in a way his penthouse had never been. Over the following weeks, they fell into a rhythm. Ethan found himself leaving work earlier to meet Clara for dinner or walks through the park near her apartment. She introduced him to used bookstores and community theater productions. He took her to a symphony performance and a rooftop restaurant where she gasped at the view of the city lights spread out below them. She was slowly coming out of her shell, her shyness giving way to a quiet confidence that captivated him. The first time he kissed her, they were standing outside her apartment building after a movie. Clara had been laughing at something he said, her face tilted up toward his, and Ethan could not resist any longer. He cupped her face gently, giving her time to pull away, but she leaned into him instead. Her lips were soft and tasted like the mint tea she had ordered after dinner, and when they finally broke apart, she was blushing furiously but smiling. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," Ethan admitted. "I was wondering if you ever would," Clara whispered back. Their relationship deepened after that. Ethan found himself sharing things he had never told anyone, about the pressure of living up to his father's legacy, about the loneliness that came with success, about dreams he had abandoned in pursuit of building his empire. Clara listened without judgment, offering quiet insights that cut through years of his carefully constructed defenses. She told him about her own fears, about feeling overlooked and invisible most of her life, about choosing books over people because stories were safer than risking rejection. She confessed that she had almost canceled their first date 3 times, convinced that someone like him could never be interested in someone like her. "You are extraordinary," Ethan told her one evening as they lay on a blanket in his living room, having abandoned any pretense of watching the movie playing on his television. "Do you not see that?" Clara smiled against his chest. "I am starting to." 2 months into their relationship, Ethan invited Clara to a charity gala his company was sponsoring. She panicked about what to wear until he offered to take her shopping, an experience that tested both their patience as Clara balked at the price tags, and Ethan tried to understand why she would not just let him buy her something beautiful. They compromised on a deep green dress that made her eyes look golden, and when Ethan saw her fully ready, hair styled and minimal makeup highlighting her natural beauty, he had to remind himself to breathe. The gala was in one of the city's most prestigious hotels, and Clara stayed close to his side, overwhelmed by the opulence and the crowd of wealthy donors and business executives. Ethan introduced her simply as Clara, not elaborating, but he noticed the curious glances and whispered conversations. He had never brought a date to one of these events before. His business partner, Marcus, cornered them at the bar. "So this is why you have been leaving the office at reasonable hours. I have to say, Dalton, I did not think anyone could crack that ice you have got surrounding your heart." Clara looked up at Ethan, something like concern crossing her face, but he just pulled her closer. "Marcus, this is Clara Holmes. Clara, this is Marcus, who apparently has nothing better to do than monitor my schedule." They laughed it off, but later, as they danced to the live orchestra, Clara asked quietly, "Do people really think you are cold?" "Yes," Ethan said honestly. "I have never particularly cared what people thought. Does it bother you? Not anymore. Not with you." He spun her gently, drawing her back against him. "You make me feel things I thought I was not capable of feeling. That matters more than some reputation I built to keep people at a distance." Clara rested her head against his shoulder, and they swayed together, lost in their own world despite the hundreds of people around them. As autumn turned to winter, Ethan found his entire life reorienting around Clara. He worked hard still, but he no longer defined himself by his company's quarterly earnings. Instead, he looked forward to evenings spent in Clara's cramped apartment, reading while she graded papers from her literacy classes, or cooking dinner together in his state-of-the-art kitchen that had barely been used before she came into his life. Clara met his mother in November, a lunch that Margaret had been eagerly anticipating since learning her son was seriously dating someone. Ethan warned Clara about his mother's enthusiasm, but Margaret was actually restrained, clearly trying not to overwhelm the quiet woman her son had brought home. By the end of lunch, the two women were discussing books animatedly, and Ethan sat back, watching them with something warm expanding in his chest. "She is wonderful," Margaret told Ethan as she hugged him goodbye. "Do not let her get away." "I do not plan to," Ethan replied. He met Clara's parents in December, driving out to the suburbs where they lived in a modest ranch house, decorated with photos of Clara at various ages. Her father, Robert, was a retired postal worker who grilled Ethan about his intentions with a protective edge that Ethan respected. Her mother, Patricia, was warm and talkative, clearly thrilled that her daughter had found someone. "Clara has always been so quiet," Patricia confided while Clara and her father were in the kitchen. "We worried she would never let anyone close enough, but she talks about you constantly, dear. You have made her so happy." The weight of that statement settled on Ethan's shoulders, a responsibility he found he wanted to carry. Making Clara happy had become his primary goal, more important than any business deal or acquisition. Christmas approached, and Ethan found himself shopping for the first time in years with actual thought and care. His assistant usually handled gifts for business associates, but choosing something for Clara required his personal attention. He finally settled on a first edition of her favorite book, a worn copy of Jane Eyre that cost him significantly more than the jewelry he had bought for past girlfriends who had never lasted beyond a few months. Clara gave him a hand-knitted scarf in soft charcoal gray, and Ethan was surprised by how much the gift meant to him, knowing she had spent hours creating something specifically for him. They spent Christmas Eve at his penthouse, snow falling outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, and Ethan realized he had never felt more at home anywhere. "I love you," he said suddenly, the words escaping before he had planned them. Clara looked up from where she was curled against him on the couch, her eyes wide. "You do?" "I do. I love you, Clara. I think I have loved you since that first night when you admitted your mother blackmailed you into the date, too." She laughed, a sound of pure joy, and threw her arms around his neck. "I love you, too. I have been terrified to say it, but I love you so much." They kissed with new urgency, the confession unlocking something deeper between them, and Ethan carried her to his bedroom, making love to her slowly, reverently, mapping every inch of her skin like territory he would spend his lifetime learning. The new year brought changes. Clara's lease was ending, and Ethan asked her to move in with him. She hesitated, worried about the optics and the speed of their relationship, but ultimately agreed because the alternative was spending nights apart, which neither of them wanted anymore. Living together revealed new dimensions of each other. Ethan learned that Clara was absolutely useless before her morning coffee, wandering around in a daze until she had consumed at least one cup. Clara discovered that Ethan had nightmares sometimes about failing, about losing everything he had built, and she learned to soothe him back to sleep with gentle touches and whispered reassurances. They fought occasionally, usually about Ethan's tendency to work too much or Clara's stubborn independence when Ethan wanted to help financially with things like her student loans. But they learned to communicate, to talk through disagreements rather than letting resentment build, and every conflict they resolved brought them closer together. In March, Ethan's company faced a major crisis when a deal worth millions fell through due to zoning complications. He came home frustrated and angry, ready to tear apart the city council that had blocked his permits. Clara listened quietly, then asked simple questions that made him reconsider his approach. By the end of the evening, he had a new strategy, one that involved community input rather than aggressive legal maneuvering, and it worked. The project was approved within weeks, and Ethan credited Clara's perspective for saving the deal. "You are good for me," he told her. "You make me better at everything." "You give yourself too little credit," Clara replied, but she was glowing from his praise. By spring, Ethan knew with absolute certainty that he wanted to spend his life with Clara. The ring he commissioned was custom designed, a vintage-style setting with a sapphire surrounded by diamonds, something unique and beautiful like her. He planned the proposal carefully, wanting it to be meaningful rather than just extravagant. He chose the library where she worked, arriving on a Saturday evening when she was closing up after a special event. Clara was shelving books, humming softly to herself, when Ethan appeared in the children's section. "You are not supposed to be here," she said, smiling. "I thought you had that dinner meeting. I canceled it. I had something more important to do." Clara set down the book she was holding, sensing something in his tone. Ethan stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "A year ago, I agreed to one blind date to make my mother happy. I walked into that restaurant expecting to endure a tedious evening with someone I would never see again. Instead, I met you." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "You changed everything, Clara. You made me understand what I was missing, what life could be when I stopped treating it like another business deal to manage. You showed me what love actually feels like, and now I cannot imagine my life without you in it." He dropped to one knee, pulling out the ring box, and Clara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Clara Holmes, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life making you as happy as you have made me?" Tears streamed down her face as she nodded frantically. "Yes, yes, of course yes." Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, and she pulled him up, kissing him with such passion that he stumbled backward into a bookshelf, sending several volumes tumbling to the floor. They laughed against each other's lips, holding tight, and Ethan felt a completeness he had never known was possible. The wedding planning was a study in compromise. Clara wanted something small and intimate, while Ethan's mother and business obligations required a certain scale. They settled on a medium-sized ceremony at a historic estate outside the city, elegant but not ostentatious. with 200 guests who actually mattered to them rather than 1,000 business acquaintances. Clara looked ethereal in her wedding dress, a simple ivory gown with lace sleeves that made her look like she had stepped out of a fairy tale. Ethan's throat tightened when he saw her walking down the aisle on her father's arm, her smile radiant with joy. They wrote their own vows, and Ethan's voice cracked with emotion as he promised to love her, protect her, and listen to her for all the days of his life. "You saved me," he said, going off script, "from a life that looked successful but felt empty. You are everything I did not know I needed, and I will spend forever being grateful that our mothers meddled." Laughter rippled through the guests, and Clara wiped away tears as she recited her own vows about taking chances, about choosing love over fear, about finding someone who saw all of her and loved her anyway. Their honeymoon was 2 weeks in Italy, wandering through Florence and Rome, eating too much pasta and gelato, making love in a villa overlooking the Tuscan countryside. Ethan had never taken this much time away from work, but Clara made it easy to forget about conference calls and acquisition deals. She was all he wanted to focus on. Returning home meant settling into married life, and Ethan found himself more content than he had ever imagined possible. Clara continued working at the library, refusing his suggestions that she did not need to work, insisting that her job gave her purpose and meaning. He respected that, even as he secretly paid off the library's budget shortfalls so that her programs would never face cuts. They hosted dinner parties at their penthouse, which Clara had gradually made warmer with plants and books and throws in rich colors. Ethan's business associates met his wife and were charmed by her quiet intelligence and genuine interest in people. His employees noticed the change in him too, the way he had become more approachable, more willing to listen to input, more balanced in his approach to leadership. A year after their wedding, Clara told Ethan she was pregnant. He stared at the test she handed him, emotions crashing through him too fast to process. Fear, joy, excitement, terror, all competing for dominance until he looked up and saw Clara watching him anxiously. "We are having a baby," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "Are you happy?" She asked tentatively. Instead of answering, he picked her up and spun her around, kissing her thoroughly. "I am terrified and thrilled and completely in love with you." The pregnancy transformed them both. Ethan became absurdly protective, hovering until Clara laughingly told him to stop treating her like she was made of glass. He read every parenting book he could find, attended every doctor's appointment, and personally oversaw the nursery design. Clara glowed with impending motherhood, her natural beauty enhanced by the changes in her body. They learned they were having a girl, and Ethan cried, imagining a daughter with Clara's gentle spirit and kind heart. They named her Emily Rose, and when she arrived on a snowy January morning, Ethan held his daughter for the first time and understood a new depth of love he had never known existed. Clara was a natural mother, patient and nurturing, singing lullabies in the middle of the night and finding joy in the exhausting chaos of caring for a newborn. Ethan split his time between the office and home, discovering that he would rather change diapers and soothe his crying daughter than close another business deal. His priorities had fundamentally shifted, and he had Clara to thank for that evolution. Their daughter grew, and their love deepened, roots going down through years of shared experiences and challenges overcome together. Ethan's company continued to thrive, but he had learned to delegate, to trust his team, to understand that his worth was not defined by how many hours he worked. Clara expanded her literacy programs, and Ethan funded a new wing at the library in her honor, watching her face when they unveiled the plaque with pride bursting in his chest. On their 5th wedding anniversary, they returned to the restaurant where they had first met, sitting at the same table by the window. Clara reached across to take his hand, her wedding ring catching the light. "Do you remember how reluctant we both were?" she asked, smiling. "I remember thinking I would endure one evening and never see you again. I remember being completely wrong about everything." Ethan raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "Thank you for agreeing to that date. Thank you for changing my life." "Thank you for being worth the risk," Clara replied softly. They toasted to meddling mothers and blind dates that turned into love stories, to taking chances and opening hearts, to building a life together that was so much richer than anything either of them had imagined possible. Emily was at home with Ethan's mother, and they had the whole evening ahead of them. But Ethan knew the best part would be going home together, climbing into bed beside his wife, and falling asleep with her in his arms. Years would pass, bringing more children, continued success, challenges, and triumphs. But the foundation would always be that first evening when a cold CEO agreed to one blind date, and a shy librarian showed up and changed everything. Their love story was not built on grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but on quiet moments of understanding, on choosing each other every single day, on building a life together one decision at a time. And Ethan would tell anyone who asked that the best decision he ever made was walking into Giovanni's that October evening with an open mind, because everything good in his life had stemmed from that single choice to give love a chance.